What if the very first humans, long before language, fire, or tools, already felt that something invisible was watching them? Imagine a world where every rustle in the grass could be a predator, every shift in the wind could signal danger, and every shadow stretching across the savannah carried a presence that no one could fully name. Could fear itself have been the first sacred force our ancestors ever believed in? This is the question that opens the deepest corridor into human evolution. Because long before religion existed, our species was already trying to make sense of the unknown. Fear was not just an emotion, it was a compass. It guided early humans in ways they could not explain. When lightning struck the ground, when the night swallowed the horizon, when the silence became too perfect, something ancient stirred inside them. That instinct, raw and overwhelming, is where the earliest rituals were born. Not as ceremonies with meaning, but as survival impulses shaped by pure instinct. The repetition of a movement, the tightening of the breath, the gathering around a specific place. These were not yet traditions, yet they held the seeds of everything that would become sacred. And this is where the invisible began to take shape in the human mind. The idea that something greater, something unseen, could influence life and death. Every small gesture mattered. A hand raised before crossing a dark passage. A stone placed near the entrance of a cave. A slow exhale before approaching a dangerous space. These simple acts were not random. They were humanity's first attempt to negotiate with forces they could not name, forces that protected, forces that threatened, forces that demanded respect. If you have ever felt that something you cannot see might still affect your life, you are closer to those ancient humans than you imagine. Their world was filled with mysteries that shaped their choices, their fears, and eventually their beliefs. And understanding their first rituals, the instinctive ones, the ones born from pure survival, opens a door into the earliest foundations of spirituality. You ever felt that strange pull, that instinct that tells you to slow down, pay attention, or step back? Share your experience in the comments, because understanding how these impulses shaped us helps keep this conversation alive. And before we continue, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed. This really supports the channel and helps this content reach more people. What comes next may surprise you even more, and the path ahead grows even deeper as we explore how fear carved the first traces of the sacred into the human mind. The world our early ancestors walked through was not silent, empty, or predictable. It was alive with signals they could not explain, patterns they sensed but could not decode, and threats that emerged without warning. Imagine standing in a vast, open landscape where your survival depended on detecting danger before it happened, yet the danger itself had no face, no form, no sound you could rely on. In this reality, the human brain began shaping the earliest interpretations of the unknown. That subtle feeling of unease, the quickening heartbeat, the instinct to look over the shoulder, these were not signs of imagination. They were the foundation of an ancient internal alarm system. Long before humans created symbols or stories, their nervous system was already reacting to forces they could sense but could not fully understand. A sudden silence meant something was hiding. A gust of wind could carry the scent of a predator. A shadow stretching across the ground at the wrong moment could signal a presence. Early humans learned to read these cues without thinking, and each reaction, each instinctive movement, shaped their perception of the invisible. Over generations, these sensations formed a map inside the human mind, a map of meanings, warnings, and intuitions that guided their every step. This internal map is where the idea of danger began to take its first spiritual shape. when something could not be seen, could not be touched, and yet had the power to influence survival. The mind filled the gap with something else: intention. And once intention was imagined, the invisible stopped being random. It started to feel alive. A rustle in the grass became a sign. A pattern in the clouds became a message. A sudden shift in temperature became a presence. This was not superstition. It was the earliest attempt to connect events, to understand cause and effect in a world with no explanations. And as these interpretations grew stronger, they began to unify entire groups. A shared sense of threat brought people closer. When a danger repeated itself in the same place, the place gained importance. When a sound returned at the same hour, the hour became meaningful. Human memory, fragile yet powerful, started preserving these moments. They became the first unwritten rules. Avoid this area after dark. Do not sleep near that formation of rocks. Leave quietly when the wind changes direction. Over time, these rules turned into patterns, and the patterns took on an emotional weight that pushed humanity toward something new: ritual. At this stage of history, danger did not simply exist. It shaped behavior, beliefs, and the beginning of symbolic thought. Early humans were not only reacting, they were interpreting, and through interpretation, they were creating the earliest forms of meaning, slowly preparing the ground for the first sacred gestures that would soon emerge. As danger shaped the earliest human instincts, something remarkable began to unfold. Certain movements, repeated over and over because they brought safety, started to gain an emotional weight that went far beyond simple survival. Picture an early human placing a hand on the ground before entering a dark space, not knowing why it felt necessary, only that doing so brought a sense of control. Or imagine a small group pausing together at the edge of a forest, taking a synchronized breath before stepping into the unknown. These were not yet ceremonies, but they were more than random actions. They were the seeds of what would someday become sacred behavior. When a gesture helped someone survive, it created a memory. When that memory was shared and repeated, it created meaning. And when meaning lingered in the mind, even after the immediate danger had passed, it formed the earliest layers of ritual. Humans discovered, without language, that repetition could build a bridge between fear and reassurance. A gesture performed once was instinct. But a gesture performed many times, across many individuals, began to feel like a protective force of its own. This shift marked a turning point in human evolution. The mind started giving symbolic value to actions that had once been purely physical. A small scratch made on a rock before resting. A stone placed at a specific point on a trail. A whispered exhale before lifting a heavy branch blocking a cave. Slowly, these actions gained rhythm. The rhythm gained memory, and memory gained power. It did not matter that early humans did not understand why these gestures worked. What mattered was the invisible thread that formed between action and outcome. When someone scratched a mark on a cave wall before sleeping and survived the night, the gesture became connected to safety. When someone left a stone by a tree before hunting and returned, unharmed, the act became connected to protection. Each success reinforced the idea that the gesture itself contained power. And so the mind began shaping what we now recognize as the earliest symbolic thought. Humans started attributing intention to the gestures themselves, imagining that perhaps these actions communicated with something unseen. The gesture was not just for the human performing it, but for the world around them. A request, a signal, a form of recognition. Ritual was born not from belief, but from instinct layered with memory and meaning. This was humanity learning to speak a silent language long before words existed, a language of movements, marks, breaths, and repeated patterns. And these patterns would soon expand beyond the body, influencing the very places where early humans chose to gather, rest, or seek protection. As early humans repeated gestures that brought safety, something else started to emerge. Certain places began to feel charged with a presence that went beyond their physical form. A cave was not just a cave. A narrow passage was not just a path. A lone tree in an open field was not just a plant. These locations became emotional anchors, shaping the way humans perceived the invisible forces surrounding them. The landscape itself became a map of meaning, where some areas felt protective while others radiated a quiet warning. Imagine walking through an ancient valley where the wind changes suddenly, forming a low hum that vibrates through the chest, or approaching a cave whose entrance remains colder than the surrounding air, even on the warmest days. These observations, repeated over countless generations, carved deep impressions in the minds of early humans. They believed these places were not merely part of nature, but gateways where unseen forces crossed into their world. The idea that danger, or protection, could reside in a specific location was the beginning of sacred geography. Certain spaces demanded silence, others encouraged caution, and a few inspired a strange sense of comfort. Humans learned to approach them with gestures, pauses, or marks on the ground. Over time, these behaviors shaped the earliest spiritual boundaries. A dark cave, with echoes that bounced unpredictably, could feel like a portal where the unknown waited. A tall and ancient tree might stand as a sentinel, its roots gripping the earth like something alive with intention. A rocky cliff that swallowed sound could feel like a place where the world listened. These sensations were not illusions. They were the result of the human mind searching for structure in an unpredictable world. If a predator repeatedly appeared near a certain area, that area became dangerous. If shelter was reliably found in another, that area became safe. The mind connected the place with the outcome, and the outcome with invisible forces. Soon, locations gained reputations. Some were avoided entirely, others were approached with caution, and a select few became gathering points for rituals that were still forming in primitive ways. As these patterns strengthened, the idea of portals took shape. Not literal doorways, but emotional thresholds. Places where the air felt heavier. Places where instincts sharpened. Places where the group moved differently, spoke differently, breathed differently. These locations were the first spiritual landmarks on Earth, long before temples, altars, or symbols existed. And they influenced how humans shaped their movements, their beliefs, and their early understanding of the forces they feared and respected. These ancient portals were not invented. They were felt. And the feelings became shared memory, passed quietly from generation to generation, forming the foundation of something far more complex that would soon emerge. Tell me in the comments if you have ever entered a place that felt different, heavier, or strangely meaningful. Describe what it was like, because these sensations connect us to the oldest layers of human experience and help expand the conversation. As places gained spiritual weight and became charged with invisible meaning, early humans began to experiment with something even more symbolic, leaving objects behind. At first it was accidental. A stone dropped near a cave entrance, a fragment of bone left on a trail. But over generations, the simple act of placing something in a meaningful location became intentional. It was as if humans sensed that interacting with these portals required acknowledgement, a subtle exchange between themselves and the unseen forces they believed hovered there. These offerings were not yet religious. They were closer to instinctive communication, shaped by fear and hope. When a group survived after leaving remnants of a hunt near a dangerous passage, the act gained importance. The next time they approached that passage, someone repeated the gesture. With repetition, the gesture became a statement, a way of saying, "We are passing through. We mean no harm. Allow us to leave safely." Early humans did not need a word for offering. The action spoke for them. The items they left behind were often the most accessible parts of their world. Small stones with unusual shapes, pieces of bark, cracked bones, dried leaves, or even faint scratches carved into surfaces. Each object carried a fragment of life, a piece of effort, a trace of energy, a moment of existence. And placing these objects in meaningful locations created an emotional and symbolic exchange that felt protective. The act did not solve problems logically, but it soothed the mind, aligning instinct with intention. In some cases, offerings were connected to guilt or fear after an unexpected event. A sudden storm, a predator encounter, or the disappearance of a member of the group could drive humans to leave something behind, hoping to rebalance a world they did not understand. These gestures were primitive attempts to negotiate with the unpredictable. If something went wrong, the offering might repair the unseen imbalance. If something went well, the offering became a token of gratitude. Over time, patterns formed. Certain objects became associated with safety, others with danger. A stone placed at the entrance of a cave might mark it as protective. A broken branch near a dark path could signify a warning. Even the ground itself carried meaning when objects were arranged in a particular way. These were the earliest forms of symbolic behavior, not based on doctrine, but on emotional logic. Humans were learning to mold their environment into a dialogue with forces they believed surrounded them. These early offerings also strengthened group cohesion. When everyone participated in the gesture, fear was shared and reassurance multiplied. It created a collective belief that the group had done something to improve their chances of survival. The act united individuals not through spoken agreement, but through shared instinct and silent understanding. These offerings were small, fragile and simple, yet they marked a profound shift in the human story. Humans were beginning to shape their world intentionally, using objects as tools for meaning rather than just survival. And these objects would soon evolve into something even more complex: signs, symbols, and markings that held the power to transform entire landscapes into spiritual territory. As offerings became more common and patterns of meaning spread through early groups, something new began to rise within these small communities. Certain individuals developed a sharper sensitivity to the invisible. They were not chosen, nor appointed, nor seen as superior. They were simply the ones who noticed more, the ones who could sense subtle changes in the environment, interpret unusual sounds, or remember the exact place where danger once appeared. Over time, these individuals became silent guides, shaping the emotional and spiritual direction of their groups. Imagine a human who could detect the faint shift in the wind before a storm, or who recognized that a certain predator returned to the same valley every season. Their instincts were not magic. They were heightened awareness, built from observation and memory. But to the rest of the group, this perception felt extraordinary. When these individuals suggested leaving an offering or avoiding a certain place, others followed. Their guidance brought safety often enough that their presence gained weight. They became the earliest form of guardians, mediators between the known and the unknown. Their role did not require authority. It emerged naturally from trust. When a group survived after following one person's instincts, their choices gained meaning. A gesture the guardian performed became worth repeating. A place they avoided became feared. A sound they recognized became a warning. These subtle influences shaped early spiritual behavior, even before humans understood the concept of leadership. The guardian's actions created pathways in the group's collective memory, a structure that connected instincts with survival. These individuals also carried emotional influence. When fear gripped the group, the Guardian's calmness shaped how others reacted. When uncertainty clouded a decision, their intuition offered direction. Even without speech, their posture, gestures, and movements communicated confidence. This emotional resonance made them central figures during moments of darkness, storms, or unexplained events. They provided a sense of order in a world dominated by unpredictability. With time, these guardians began to bridge the gap between ritual and interpretation. They were the first to notice patterns in marks left on the ground, in the behavior of animals, or in the reactions of their own group to specific places. Their ability to read these signs gave them a unique role. Others watched how they approached certain trees, stones, or caves. They learned gestures by imitation. A practice performed by the Guardian slowly became tradition. And yet, these early spiritual figures were not protected by power. Their heightened sensitivity often made them more vulnerable to fear, carrying the emotional weight of the group. They felt responsible for outcomes they could not fully control, pushing them deeper into the realm of the invisible. They were the first humans to seek meaning beyond immediate survival, exploring the thin boundary between instinct and belief. These ancestral guardians did not create spirituality. They revealed it through awareness, through memory, through the subtle art of interpreting a world that was still wild and incomprehensible. And their influence paved the way for what would soon become one of the most profound forces in human evolution: the rituals shaped by the darkness of the night. Night was not just the absence of light for early humans. It was a living force, one that reshaped every instinct, sharpened every fear, and pushed the mind into places untouched during the day. When the sun dropped beyond the horizon, the world transformed into something ancient and unpredictable. Predators moved with confidence, shadows stretched into unfamiliar forms, and silence grew heavy enough to feel. In this darkness, the human imagination expanded, filling the void with presences that could not be seen but felt overwhelmingly close. For our ancestors, night was the first great testing ground of the mind. Every crack of a twig or distant howl carried meaning. The air itself seemed to shift, thickening around the body, making each breath deliberate. Groups huddled together, building small circles of safety around dying embers of fire, watching the edge of the darkness as if it were a boundary into another world. And in many ways it was. The border between the visible and the invisible grew thin at night, inviting interpretations that shaped the earliest spiritual behaviors. The first rituals against evil often appeared in these hours. Simple movements gained urgency. A hand pressed against the chest before lying down. A circle traced in the dirt around where the group would sleep. A stone placed near the entrance of a shelter to guard against whatever moved in the dark. These gestures were not superstition. They were emotional armor, ways to create order within the chaos of night. The mind needed a sense of control, even when control was impossible. The guardians of the group became even more important when darkness fell. Their ability to interpret unfamiliar sounds or sense approaching danger brought reassurance. Others mirrored their movements, adopting their gestures instinctively. If the guardian paused before settling, everyone paused. If they traced a shape in the ground, others copied it. These synchronized actions turned individual instincts into collective rituals, performed not through understanding, but through the shared need for protection. As generations passed, night rituals grew more elaborate. The place where the group slept became a sacred space, defined by repeated gestures and patterns. Marks on rocks near sleeping areas, positions chosen deliberately, and the way bodies arranged themselves for rest all carried meaning. These rituals did not push darkness away, but they created a psychological barrier between the group and the unknown lurking beyond the light. In the minds of early humans, this barrier mattered. It meant survival. It meant preparation. It meant respect for forces they could not name. Night shaped humans by challenging their deepest fears and offering no clear answers. And from this challenge, rituals of protection grew. Fragile, instinctive, and profoundly human. They were the first attempts to negotiate with the darkness, transforming fear into action and action into meaning. Tell me in the comments if you have ever felt that night changes the world around you, even in small ways. Write a few words about it, because these impressions reveal how much of our ancient instincts still live inside us today. As the night-shaped fear and instinct turned into ritual, something profound began to happen. Some of these behaviors genuinely improved the chances of survival. What started as emotional shields evolved into practical strategies that helped early humans face predators, weather, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature. Even without understanding why a gesture worked, repeating it often made the difference between life and death. This is where spirituality and survival began to blur, merging into a single thread woven through human evolution. Imagine a group that consistently cleared the ground before sleeping, not because they understood hygiene, but because it made them feel protected. That gesture reduced insects, avoided hidden dangers, and created a safer place to rest. Or consider the habit of gathering in circles, which formed not from belief in a symbol, but from instinctive unity. A tight formation allowed early humans to detect movement more easily, conserve heat, and react together to approaching threats. Rituals that felt spiritual were also shaping practical systems of defense. Even offerings played a role in survival. Leaving bones or remains at specific spots diverted scavengers away from sleeping areas, even if early humans explained this effect through invisible forces. By performing the action repeatedly, they unknowingly established patterns that reduced risk. A stone placed at an entrance could warn others of a dangerous area or guide them toward safer ground. These markers became part of a shared intelligence long before humans developed language. Night rituals also strengthened alertness. Sitting in silence, listening for patterns in the dark, heightened sensory awareness. Touching certain objects before resting or positioning themselves in familiar formations reduced stress and helped the group remain calm enough to detect real danger. Anxiety could cloud perception, but ritual soothed the mind, allowing instinct to function more clearly. The emotional structure created by these practices became part of the group's survival toolkit. Even the places chosen for rituals were often strategically beneficial. High ground reduced ambush risk. Caves offered stable temperature and protection from wind. Areas with specific sounds or airflow patterns made it easier to sense predators. But early humans did not select these places analytically. They selected them because they felt powerful or safe or heavy with presence. Their intuition guided them toward locations that offered natural advantages. And every repeated experience reinforced these choices, transforming instinct into tradition. Over generations, these practices formed a complex network of behaviors that shaped early human life. Rituals created order in uncertainty, taught patterns without schooling, and passed essential knowledge across time without needing words. What felt sacred was often deeply practical. What felt guided by invisible forces was often rooted in environmental wisdom refined through survival. These early humans were not merely reacting to danger. They were crafting a system of meaning that made the world more navigable. And that system would soon transfer itself not only through gestures and places, but through memory. the silent, powerful engine that preserved behaviors long after their origins were forgotten. As the early rituals shaped behavior and improved survival, another force began operating quietly beneath the surface of human experience. Memory. Not the memory of words or stories, but the memory stored in gestures, patterns, places, and sensations. Long before humans could speak, they remembered through repetition. A ritual survived not because someone explained it, but because it felt necessary. And feeling was the first teacher. Imagine a child born into a small group, watching adults repeat the same movements before, entering a cave, or placing a stone in a specific spot, or arranging their sleeping circle in a familiar formation. That child did not need to know why the group acted that way. The meaning was transmitted through observation, through the emotional weight carried by the gesture itself. Fear, safety, anticipation, and relief were the invisible threads that bound memory to action. The child learned the ritual by absorbing its atmosphere. Over generations, this emotional memory became a powerful mechanism. It allowed practices to drift across time, even when their original purpose faded. A gesture that once protected the group from predators could remain long after the predator no longer frequented the area. But its emotional significance persisted. The ritual carried the echo of ancient danger, preserved through bodies rather than explanations. This form of memory was deeply collective. When a group repeated the same movements together, a shared rhythm emerged. The synchronized acts created unity, which strengthened retention. The mind remembers better when the body participates. And early humans lived in a world where memory had to exist in the body, not in symbols or language. Every ritual was a lesson encoded in movement, transmitted through generations without a single spoken instruction. Even the landscape played a role in preserving memory. Certain places became associated with rituals, not because someone declared them sacred, but because experiences accumulated there. A cave where the group survived a storm became tied to protection. A clearing where danger struck became tied to caution. Returning to these places reactivated old memories, reinforcing patterns and renewing the emotional weight of the rituals performed there. Over time, humans began to anticipate meaning before experiencing it. A child stepping into a place where generations had repeated a ritual felt the weight of the past without knowing its history. The environment itself became a teacher, pressing its presence into the mind. Memory took shape not through stories, but through atmosphere. This allowed rituals to stretch far beyond their original context, becoming part of the psychological architecture of humanity. These early transmissions formed the backbone of something much larger. When gestures and places became infused with memory, they began to feel like connections to forces greater than the individuals performing them. Humans sensed continuity, a thread linking them with those who came before. And as this connection grew stronger, rituals evolved from survival strategies into something deeply symbolic, a foundation that would soon transform into belief, into meaning, into the earliest form of the sacred. As memory shaped gestures and gestures shaped meaning, something extraordinary began to take form inside the early human mind. Rituals no longer existed only to manage fear or increase survival. They began to feel like bridges between worlds. One, visible, the other felt through instinct, sensation, and the weight of shared experience. When early humans performed these actions, they were not only recalling the past, they were reaching for something larger, something that existed beyond themselves. This shift marked the birth of the sacred. The invisible forces that once felt unpredictable slowly took on intention. A place that had protected the group for generations seemed to carry a presence that watched over them. A gesture repeated during dangerous moments became a request for guidance. A mark carved into a stone was no longer just a sign for others. It was a message to whatever listened in the dark. Humans were learning to communicate with the world as if it were alive, responsive, and woven with meaning. This emerging sense of connection changed everything. Rituals began shaping identity, not just behavior. They unified groups through shared purpose and created a silent understanding that life was influenced by more than instinct and chance. Firelight became a symbol of safety. Shadows became symbols of warning. The wind, the echo of a cave, the alignment of bodies during rest. Each element carried a spiritual charge that grew stronger with time. As these meanings deepened, belief formed naturally. Humans did not invent belief. Belief emerged from the emotional patterns carved into their lives. The rituals that once provided comfort now felt like dialogue. Early humans sensed that something responded when they acted with intention. Whether real or imagined, the feeling was powerful enough to shape how they moved, gathered, hunted, slept, and survived. The sacred was not separate from life. It was woven into daily existence. This slow transformation marked the beginning of spiritual consciousness, the idea that the world was animated by forces both protective and threatening, forces that humans could interact with through action, repetition, and memory. These early beliefs created the foundation for everything that would come later: symbols, myths, guardians, taboos, and eventually the first traces of what we now call religion. Yet at this stage, the sacred was intimate, immediate, and entirely rooted in lived experience. It grew from the ground beneath their feet, from the sky above their heads, from the fear they carried, and the hope they could not explain. And even though millions of years have passed, the echoes of these early rituals still live quietly inside us, in the places that make us pause, in the gestures we repeat without knowing why, in the moments when the invisible feels close enough to touch. If you stayed with me until here, let me know in the comments by writing the phrase, "This message was for me," because I want to know who crossed this entire path with me. And if this journey through our ancient origins helped you see the world with new eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next step of this exploration. Leave your like as, well, it helps keep this kind of content alive and growing. And if you want to continue expanding this story, there is another video right here on the side that deepens everything we uncovered today. Click and keep walking with me through the next chapter of our past.